people of the Eora Nation.
Traditional owners of the land. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to elders from any other communities who may be here with us today. My name is Veronica Sullivan. I'm very lucky to be on the board of the Feminist Writers Festival, and I'll be just introducing today's session before we pass over to our fantastic panel. Thank you for coming along to this afternoon's session, Why Women Read Fiction and Men Don't. Before we get started, please make sure that your phones are on silent as we are recording and live streaming this event. But we'd love you to join in on social media using the hashtag FWF2018. Please also be aware that questions and comments in the audience component, the Q&A component, will be recorded and broadcast. So I'll introduce our panel and then we'll throw over to them for some wonderful conversation, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for your questions, so please do be thinking about those during the convo. So to introduce, from the far end, we have Kerryn Goldsworthy. Kerryn is an Adelaide writer and a former university lecturer in literature. She's published books, essays, short stories and reviews, and was the inaugural chair of the judging panel for the Stella Prize. She won the 2013 Pascal Prize for Cultural Criticism and the 2017 Horn Prize for her essay, The Limit of the World. Next to Kerryn is Anna Funda. Anna is one of Australia's most acclaimed and awarded writers. Her novel, All That I Am, won the Miles Franklin Prize. Starterland, hailed as a classic, won the 2004 Samuel Johnson Prize for Best Nonfiction published in English, and both books are published in over 25 countries. Next to Anna is Debra Adelaide. Debra is the author and editor of more than 15 books, including reference works, fiction and non-fiction. Her research areas include Australian women writers and contemporary readership. Her published fiction includes the best-selling novel The Household Guide to Dying and The Women's Pages, and the short story collections Letter to George Queenie and the forthcoming Zebra. She is Associate Professor in Creative Writing at UTS. And closest to me is Anita Heiss. Anita is the author of non-fiction, historical fiction, commercial fiction and children's novels. She's a regular guest at writers' festivals and travels internationally, performing her work and lecturing on Aboriginal literature. She's a lifetime ambassador of the Indigenous Literacy Foundation and a proud member of the Wiradjuri Nation of Central New South Wales. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Hi everyone. Before we begin with the questions, Dr. Heiss has something to say to you.
Yurjumaram, Yuldu Yanada Heiss, Baladu Wiradjuri Gialam. Aramachipo, Branglibu, Megandi Bala Williams, Yingamada Dul, Gadigugu, Mangu. So I just wanted to say I'm learning the Wiradjuri language. I wanted to acknowledge country, but thank you. Acknowledge country, and because my next novel, the dialogue of the main characters will be all in Wiradjuri language. Well, that's the plan. It may not.
We'll have to learn. This topic is, of course, a slightly contentious one. Why women read fiction and men don't. Immediately, I'm expecting someone to leap up and say, not all men. And that is, of course, true. Not all women either. But the thing is, there are endless statistics, and I will not bore you with statistics because there's nothing worse than a situation like this. There are endless statistics to show that women do, in fact, read more than men generally, and very specifically read a great deal more fiction than men do. So we're addressing this as a kind of general proposition. There's statistical evidence that women read more novels, that women belong to more book clubs, that women use libraries more, and that women buy more books. I can remember at the Melbourne Writers' Festival 20 years ago, one of the visiting writers, a man, saying disdainfully that, you know, most of the people at the Writers' Festival appear to be middle-aged women in hats. Now, yeah, as a middle-aged woman in a hat, I took umbrage. But another male writer, and I'm fairly sure it was the Irish writer Roddy Doyle. Some of you may have seen the movie of The Commitments. Roddy Doyle wrote the novel and I think also the screenplay for that. Took issue with this bloke, and he said the women in hats, the middle-aged women in hats, are our readers and the people who buy our books, and pointed out that some respect was due. And interestingly, that line seems to have sort of faded over the last 20 years or so. I can't remember, it was a member of the panel, I can't remember which which one who alerted me to a story about another male writer, frequenter of writers' festivals, Ian McEwan, author of Atonement and other, best-selling literary fiction, who apparently conducted an experiment one day. He went into the park with his son and started handing out free copies of his novels. The men were very suspicious. What's this? Why are you giving me this? Oh, it's a book. And the women descended on him like locusts. Ripped the books out of his nerveless fingers, and his conclusion from this experience was, when women stop reading, the novel will be dead. So there's a little background for you. Here's a slightly more earthy bit of background for you from a blog deathlessly called The Good Men Project, and I quote, "Men would get laid more often if they read more fiction." I was thinking of, doing a survey, true, false. Perhaps they should ask. A couple of things about the topic. The topic, as we got it, implies not only a clear distinction between men and women, but also a clear distinction between fiction and non-fiction. That is contentious because I think it's clear to all of us that both of those boundaries are actually starting to break down. There are large grey areas between the categories of men and women, and between the categories these days especially of fiction and non-fiction. I hope we can explore those questions as we go. If they come up in the flow of conversation, that would be great. I should also point out that every woman on this stage has published at least one book of fiction and at least one book of non-fiction, so we're all talking from our own experience, and that might be where we start. I want to ask the panel what their personal experience has been when it comes to this topic. I mean, what were the things that went through your mind when you first saw that this was the topic that we would be discussing? What do the men think about this? Maybe start with you, Anita.
I'm happy to try just because I've got a great hair. Which is best. This is working. Well, I have two little anecdotes, personal ones, in response to that, Kerryn. My dear old dad, who died a few months ago, always maintained that he couldn't read fiction, particularly by women, that he couldn't get into the head of a woman. It was completely alien to him. And he used to say this with some glee because he then would follow that up with, well, that means I don't have to read your next book. So, in fact, he didn't read most of the books I've published, and it really didn't worry me. But I do think about that quite a bit, why men have these very hard and fast rules about what they will and won't read. And the other personal anecdote is from the other generation, my youngest son, who, when he picked up the women's pages when it was published a couple of years ago, and he read the first page, he groaned and said, "Oh, domestic stuff again. Why don't you write a book that I can read?" And that is still my challenge, actually. I'm very interested in exploring how I could write a book that would appeal to a young man, but also to a reader such as myself.
The idea that it's domestic stuff that he responded to.
Well, it just happened to be on the first page. The whole novel wasn't domestic.
As in kitchens and bathrooms or
Cooking
food.
food.
Yeah. Perhaps you could point him to your Adelaide book or something. So those are family stories. So that's your first-hand knowledge of blokes responding to your own work. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that neither of them felt clearly any obligation to be positive about it.
And not only that, not even the slightest sense of obligation that they should read anything written by their daughter or their mother. Which, in a way, doesn't really bother me because I know I'm not writing for them. I know I'm not writing for my immediate family members.
No. And what about you? What was your first thought about your own experience when you saw it?
My first thought about this topic wasn't actually about my own experience so much as I think that women do. I'm in this very cranky middle-aged phase at the moment, and I'm writing a long feminist essay, and I think it's literally going to strangle me because it's never ending, and every day that goes on, there's something more I have to put into it. So it's like this magic pudding of a thing that's going to kind of strangle me. But I think that women have to do a lot of the emotional work of keeping family and, by extension, extended family and friends and society going. And that work, which is work, is associated with our essence as women. Women are caring in some essential way. Well, I'm not sure that applies to me. I experience that obligation to care, for some people as automatic and for other people as work, and it's work. And that is a whole sphere of intimate emotional life that involves very sophisticated psychological skills, not all of which I have. But that is also the terrain of a novel. So I think that women are attracted to reading novels because we operate in a world where the obligations on us, which are enormous, they're about the mental health of all the people around us. We learn a lot by reading books that represent complicated interpersonal arrangements and complicated psychology on a massive spectrum from psychological violence to psychological well-being. And that is a spectrum of what is pejoratively called the domestic novel. So it is incredible to me that something that is so massive and so important to society as a whole can be diminished as domestic. And I think that's what this title, in its essence, it's not doing it, but it's drawing attention to that fact. And then, see, I need to be stopped. This is part of it.
I'll
say one more thing. So that led me to thinking a little bit about this moment in patriarchy, really. So if half the population is somehow going to be made into a minority, which is an incredible thing to do. So in patriarchy, that's the essence of it. Half the population is made into a special interest group. So that is women or women's fiction. It's the same mechanism as, say, where professions are all women, like nurses or teachers or something. They are then diminished. It's a similar but much more massive thing that's going on. So patriarchy has to work very, very hard to suppress women and their interests. And we are now at a moment where we're seeing that work very explicit. We're seeing it in David Pepper. We're seeing it with the whole Weinstein thing, the Jeffrey Bush thing, what happened at Channel 7. We're seeing the seams crack in the very hard work that patriarchy has to do to make women into a special interest group. And so I kind of understand the title of this session, but I think it's necessary, we should draw attention to it, in order to refuse it and refute it. So
Thank you. Right. Well, Anita, what about you? What are your first thoughts?
Having done a very similar session at the Byron Writers Festival this year, and 2 years in a row at another festival at exactly the same time on a Sunday morning, Susan Johnson and I did a session on women's writing. Exactly the same session. And when I saw this title, I thought to myself, why are we still having to validate through these conversations what we do, why we do it, who we write for, and the women's stories? Well, stories that are about the lives of women, in whatever genre, that they matter. And I was just thinking when you were talking about your dad, because I didn't come from a home with books. I think my father read me one golden book as a child, and the only time he read was when we were up in the mountains and he read westerns. And on the hierarchy of literature, that's the bottom, and I write chick lit, which is just one rung up. But what I realised now, thinking about my dad, and as a non-reader, as English as a second language, it was seeing what he liked, the John Wayne thing on the page. And because I write across genre, children's fiction, women's fiction, whatever you want to call it, I'm always trying to reach an audience about issues that are important to me. And I think, I don't know how other people write, but I'm thinking women, like women of colour, want to see women of colour on the page and so forth. And so I think more women are reading books because they're looking for things, they're seeing themselves themselves on the page, and men are reading books and seeing themselves in different areas. And I don't see it as a problem. I see what I think the issues for me is that we're constantly having to validate, particularly myself in writing what is regarded as not highbrow literature, validate what I do as a female writing stories that I want other females in Australia to read. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I do think, I've started to think myself as this business about highbrow literature or literary fiction or whatever you want to call it is starting to break down a little bit. Like, other boundaries that we talked about. I find myself again and again, because I read novels for a living basically, I read an awful lot of them. And I see just as many excellent genre novels, by which I mean things that have set out to be crime novels, set out to be GP or whatever. Excellent genre novels and really, really terrible novels that think of themselves as literary fiction. So it isn't a matter of whether it's good makes literary, it's a matter of whether it's good in its genre. And I think people are starting to actually acknowledge that more and more.
I think to myself also, because when we get these topics and questions, it does make us transport ourselves to moments when we've been at libraries or festivals and remember who's in the audience. And for instance, I have a children's novel about the stolen generations that many adults read because they're not going to read the Bringing Them Home report, but they want to learn about and be transported through story. And I've had retired men come up to me at festivals having read that novel, although it wasn't designed for them. And I remember being at the Reality Bites Festival in Noosa some years ago, which was a non-fiction, I think it was a non-fiction festival. For some reason, I was talking about Paris Dreaming, and there was a man in the audience in question time, his hand went up first, and his question was, I want to know why you didn't mention men in your novel till page 90, or something like that. Which is interesting, because I had no idea, I don't even know if that's true, I haven't checked it, but he knew what page number that the first male's dialogue appeared in. So there are these pockets of gentlemen who are engaging in our work as well, which is not on maths.
That sounds to me like someone setting out to do a deliberate critique, though. That sounds like a gotcha question. I'm really interested in your phrase transported by story, so interested. I'm going to start jumping around in my questions here, but one of the things I noticed, I was asked when I wrote a piece about this topic for Spectrum magazine, which appeared last weekend, and when I was thinking about how I would do this, the two things that kept coming to mind were something that happened to me when I was a little kid, which was that I was reading Elizabeth Gouge's The Little White Horse in the school library, and I was so engrossed that I missed the bus. And my poor long-suffering mother had to come and get me. And the other one was a painting, a 19th century painting of a young woman in full Victorian dress lying on the grass. The painting is called The New Novel, and it's a painting of a woman completely engrossed. She is away, you could explode a bomb next to her and she wouldn't hear it. She's completely engrossed in this book she's reading. And that kind of intensity with which women read is something I've not seen with blokes so much. One of the neurologists I was reading on this subject said women can stay still for long thinking. And I think that's probably true as well. If anyone here is a primary school teacher in particular, you probably agree with that. So it's you can think of all sorts of little anecdotal bits and pieces here and there out of your own experience, but it's quite hard to pull together an actual thesis, isn't it, out of a topic like this. So I thought what I would do is ask, because you're all writers, is say, how do you envisage your readership, and does that have anything to do with gender, or is it something you want to have an ideal reader? Who is it?
I don't have an ideal reader, and I don't have a particular reader in mind when I'm looking at something. And I think I don't actually wouldn't know the gender who it's. I wouldn't know how many men or women. So, like when they're two main books, and they have women really as the main characters, and but I think a lot of men have from that. I spend a lot of time. It's a bit like getting a piece of marble. You've got an idea for a project, and this is going to be the shape of it, and you're hacking away to try and make something like a statue that makes sense and also stands up, and anyone think once you start the writing, you're starting hacking at this piece of novel, and then the requirements of the work itself take over. So I don't. Sometimes when I'm frightened, I think about a reader. I'm just like a friendly reader, but I don't think about a reader in terms of gender or age or anything like that. And I try and make the work as clear as possible so that anyone can read it. Swaziland has been for many years on the HSC list, so there's a lot of 17-year-old readers, and I certainly wasn't envisaging them. And one in particular, my daughter who's starting HSC this year, who I think, thank God, doesn't have to study it, because I certainly wasn't ever thinking that my children, because I would have any children, then would be reading this book, so yeah, not a lot of thought into it.
What about you two? Apart from your immediate family, what
you were talking a while ago about the difference between writing fiction and non-fiction. And when you asked that question, I immediately thought back to when I first started doing your column, which I only did, I don't know how you keep doing this as long as you have, I only did it for 4 years. And I felt like I'd run out of adjectives.
This is a short reviews
A
column.
weekly book review. Well, it was weekly when I did it. So, yeah. Kerryn has done it for over 10 years.
I've stopped counting.
It's an extraordinary experience. And when I first started writing those book reviews, and these were 150-word book reviews, 5 books a week, I was reading obviously very, very quickly. But also crafting the responses was a huge challenge, because although I've been used to writing book reviews, writing something to get the essence to distill to 150 words was a particular challenge. And I actually found I needed to think really carefully about who I was writing the reviews for. And at the time I had a very good friend who was a very critical person, and he was a great reader and he loved reading what I wrote, but he would often ring me up and say, I don't think that was a very good sentence, or you should have chosen a better word. But he was an engaged reader, and I found it extraordinarily helpful to think of him when I first started writing those book reviews, because I thought I need to focus, I need to know who I'm writing for, and he's like the perfect reader for these reviews. So I didn't continue to write them with him in mind, but certainly when I was starting out, I found that incredibly helpful. When it comes to my fiction, it's very different. I always say that I write for myself, first and foremost. So in a sense, that should make me my ideal reader. But I've just been reflecting on this fairly recently, actually, and it struck me that having written the book for myself that I desperately want to read, I then don't go and read it. Because by the time it's finished and edited and proofread and out there, I have absolutely no interest whatsoever in rereading it. So this is probably a discussion for another panel altogether, actually. So it's interesting that although I've written for myself, I don't end up being the reader of my books. But it's very important for me when I'm writing to write towards that notion of a reader or a readership. It's very important to me that I have a sense of who that reader is, because otherwise I feel I'm just writing into some weird void. C.S. Lewis actually said he wrote the Narnia books because no one was writing the kind of books he wanted to read. And I completely understand that. I feel great empathy with that approach. The other thing that propels me as a writer is trying to solve a particular question. And it's a little bit different, I guess, to the sorts of fiction that Anita's writing, because Anita's using story to explain something or shed light on something that's, been suppressed, or information about Aboriginal culture that we've turned our backs on, or all those sorts of reasons. I write because I have a problem or one question that I absolutely have to solve, otherwise I won't sleep. And that sort of connects to the sense of who my readers might be. Right. People who are interested in pursuing those questions. In those questions,
yeah. harking back to your ideal reader for the book reviews, and when you said, you run out of adjectives, there's a thing called book review bingo, which is, all the bingo squares, and they have in them things like tour de force.
Oh, yeah.
Unputdownable.
Page turner.
And the two hurdles there that I fall over all the time are, there were two that just made me cringe. One was lyrical and the other one was haunting. And I thought, I can never say lyrical or haunting again.
No.
I just can't, no matter how lyrical and haunting this book may be, I'm not allowed to say so. Anita, what about you? You've got a more specific audience, don't you, in some ways?
There's not enough of us to sustain any publishing ventures, so the audience has to be much broader than just blackfellas. But every project is different.
Yeah.
And so obviously if I'm commissioned to write a children's novel, I know the audience is quite specific for 8 to 10 and so forth. I chose to write a couple of novels with young boys as characters because I realised I'd only ever written female stories, and I really wanted to provide a different story on the page and encourage young boys to read, so that was quite specific. I'm very driven by place, and I think the audience of the place that I write about is very important to me for authenticity, for them to have a sense of ownership and engagement with the story. So my novel, Barbed Wire and Cherry Blossom, set in Cowra, about the Cowra breakout. I had the idea, and I wasn't thinking about audience at the time, except that the Australian literary landscape had failed to talk about Aboriginal people going to war and Wiradjuri people being in World War II and so forth. And so I felt compelled, there was purpose to write this story. But as I got into the research and I spent time in Cowra, I realised how important it was for that town, and my mother was born on the Rambi Mission in Cowra, for that town to actually love this story. It was, if they didn't love this story, then that book had no purpose whatsoever, really. Right. So I always want to get it right. So I send drafts to, the Cowra Breakout Association and so forth to make sure I've got everything right on the ground. The Stolen Generation story, I got commissioned to write the Who Am I, the Diary of Mary Talons, because they wanted it for a school audience and so forth. And what I realised by doing all the research around that was the audience for me was not only school students, it was really the audience were all the Aboriginal people who were removed, who didn't have a voice to tell their story. So that this was really for them as well, and for people who never found their way home. So.
Wonderful.
But my female novels, I hate all this terminology, but the commercial women's novels, whatever, they're the ones you see at the airport. So we like that. It's not rocket science. I mean, I guess if you're going to spend a year or 2 or 5 years writing a book, you want someone to read it. And my chick lit novels are read by men and women. I think maybe men are reading to get some ideas about how we think about dating or don't think about dating, what to do, what not to do.
Tips.
Few hot tips. Yeah, I'm still single, so I've got no tips for the women. So in Australian novelists, my friends like Rosie Scott and Georgia Blaine, and I was thinking, I never saw women like me on the page. And I thought, how do I reach the readers they're reaching to start thinking about issues that were important to me, black deaths in custody, the intervention, the complexities of identity in the 21st century, breaking down stereotypes. How do I reach all those women? Well, they read books about relationships. And so it was a strategic move to me, even though my French publisher couldn't believe I was writing chick lit. Why would you write this? And I said, well, because I want to reach these readers, and they don't know who Anita Heiss is. They may never pick up a book by an Aboriginal woman, and they're not going to find my other books Glee books, because they're here today and we love Glee books, but they're not going to find them in Target and Kmart.
No.
So it's about finding ways to reach an audience with the messages that I wanted to have.
Strategic, as you say. I love it that you're proudly prepared to own the label chick lit.
Call it chocolate because they're brown.
Chocolate. It's a subgenre, because I as I was saying before, there's some really great chick lit around. There's also some really terrible chick lit. It's not about the genre; it's about the quality of what you're doing within the sort of conventions of what you're doing. I got into terrible trouble once on a panel like this at a Sydney Writers' Festival a few years ago because I innocently really said to one of the panellists, and this was true about her book. It had all the conventions of chick lit.
I was in the audience.
Oh, were you there?
And I was horrified.
Well, so was I, Anita.
Because that conversation started a whole series of conversations that Lisa Heidke and Susan Johnson and I had about when writers attack genres when genres attack writers fight back. Because by dismissing a genre, whatever genre that is, you criticise the readers of that genre as well.
Well, that's true too, yeah.
So we're not giving away any names here on that panel. But I
No,
was
we're
in the
no.
audience.
No names, no pack drill, but I just said something innocent like, it follows the conventions of chick lit, and she was really annoyed with me. She got really upset with me. She says, not chick lit. I don't write chick lit. I said, okay, well, yeah. But it was an interesting moment, wasn't it, that?
I think she said something like, it was worse than that. It was like, she was offended. She was. I think you might have said, I'm offended. I would never write chick lit. And what it really criticises anybody that reads in whatever the genre you're criticising. It criticises your reader, and I think that's a really offensive thing to do. We all have different tastes. Some people like jazz and music, some people like hip hop. We all have different ways of listening, we have different ways of reading, we all have different ways of writing, and all of it's valid.
There's a wonderful, you've just made me think, there's a wonderful moment in Little Women, which some of you will remember when I remind you of it, when Jo, who as you may recall is a budding writer and has had stories published, and Amy are going out visiting somewhere, and one of the people they're visiting says, oh, I liked your last story. And Jo, who hates being praised and is very prickly, says something like, oh, well, I just write that rubbish to make money. Ordinary people like it. And there's this chilly little silence in the room because the woman has, of course, really enjoyed the story and feels insulted in exactly the way you're describing. There's all these kind of sub-hierarchies in readership as well about expectation and quality. Apropos, more or less, one of the things I wanted to ask the panel about was, again, because everybody here writes fiction and non-fiction, when we first set up the Stella Prize in 2011, there was much discussion about what books would be eligible. And when we decided that it wasn't going to be another prize for a novel, that other books, specifically, non-fiction as well as fiction, would be eligible for the prize, we got a lot of pushback. It was interesting. People were saying, this is nonsense, you can't have a non-fiction book competing with a fiction book. That raises larger questions about prizes. But what do you all, as writers in both genres, think about the idea that they should be sort of considered for a prize together and in competition with each other? Does that make sense to you? Thinking about the female specificity of the Stella Prize and the idea that, fiction and non-fiction have different gender qualities.
Well, I guess considering that when we talk about non-fiction, we know we're not talking about textbooks and technical stuff. We're talking about creative non-fiction. To me, that isn't a problem at all, because I think it's about telling a good story, and whether you choose a medium of fiction or non-fiction is irrelevant. I think you can very effectively evaluate a good piece of fiction compared to a good piece of non-fiction. Because to me, as a reader anyway, it's always about the narrative. It's not about whether it's real or made up. That's kind of irrelevant. But the bottom line for me is it's just great to have a prize, and a prize that honours women's writing. So I wouldn't nitpick about the terms of or the conditions at all. It would be problematic if you're trying to include other forms like poetry. I think it would be very hard if it was broadened to that extent.
You need specialist judges for poetry too, I think, in a way that's kind of hard to organise. What about you, Anna? Have you got any thoughts about that?
Well, I really agree with Debra. I think that if you're having a prize for women's writing, it's probably not that hard to make a distinction among books. Whether they're fiction or non-fiction, you're picking the best book, that you're recommending, and I think that that's fine. And so I think that those genre boundaries are said to be very fluid between fiction and non-fiction. Personally, in my practice, I don't. I mean, I draw a very distinct line between what's fiction and what's non-fiction. And I've had to think about this because sometimes Stasi-Land's stuck under fiction, or people write to me saying great novel, or And the whole point of that for me was that it was non-fiction. You know, the book has books have a different, readers enter into a different contract with the writer, with the book. If you think that something is non-fiction, you read it differently from if you think that it's fiction. So the quality of the writing can utterly be compared across those genres, but the contract you're making with the reader is different. The reader is entitled to expect that what is in a non-fiction book is true. Of course, the truth is a malleable category, but getting less and less so. The more we have allegations of fake news, the more important it is to know exactly what's true and what's not true. So in, say, Stasiland, which is obviously narrative non-fiction or creative non-fiction or whatever, everything in it is true. What makes it, which is very important to me, and where that line had to be drawn, I didn't know this when I was doing it, I've only had to really think about it afterwards, is in non-fiction for me, where I can't go is into somebody's head unless they let me in. So unless a character in Stasiland said to me, this is what it felt like to climb the Berlin Wall, to be in interrogation, to, you know, be in psychiatry or whatever, I wasn't going to go and imagine what that was like. Many, many very good non-fiction writers will do that. I don't. I see that as that's the line that I draw. So I will describe what it was like for them, but they will have had to tell me what that was like. Yeah. And I will then put it. Whereas in a novel, that's the absolute purpose of the novel, is to go into someone else's head. So I see those categories as very distinct, but I don't think that that affects a prize at all for women's writing. You can totally assess whether it's a great book or not across genres.
Yeah. Anita, what about you?
I really can't add much. I think it's about the story. The story is told well or it's not told well. And I think I write historical fiction, so in terms of the difference between fiction and non-fiction, I expect, and the expectation of the reader and the right of the reader to know what they're reading is factually correct and so forth. I think I take the same process and the same ethics to my fiction as well, to make sure that if I'm writing about a historical moment in time, that those facts are spot on. And I sign contracts often that say that I'm responsible for what is in that novel. Yeah. That what I say to be fact is fact, that I've done all the research and that I'm responsible if there's any fallout around that as well. Yeah. God. Yeah. Just remember that.
Yeah, you do. It's funny. I getting back to what Anna said just for a minute, and you know, this speaks to what you were saying as well. The idea of getting into other people's heads. I don't know about the rest of you. I read a lot of biography, and the biography that drives me absolutely up the wall is the one where the person actually doesn't have a lot of material and there's a lot missing. So you get this preponderance of the conditional tense. He would have felt terrible. You know, she should have done such and such. It's possible that so and so would have happened. I don't know this for sure. And don't write the book would be my... And it looks like you agree with me.
Who are you talking about? Come on.
Oh, no. Seriously, this is not a real person. No, this is just... I've read a number of bios where people do that, and I just don't think they should. Write about the material you've got, leave the rest of it out, you know. I want to get back to the question of what we're calling domestic fiction. Debra, I know that you in particular have a great interest in the materiality of domestic life, you know, the sort of material reality, the stuff that's right in front of you. So I thought of you. I was reading a neurologist, I think, or a biologist, saying that women's brains are wired to respond to people and men's brains are wired to respond to stuff. And this did seem to me to be largely true. You know, men like action thrillers that are full of sort of fast cars and fancy surveillance equipment and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And women like characters. Women like sort of engaging with and empathising with people. But stuff plays a very important part, doesn't it, in a certain kind of domestic fiction about women's lives. I've noticed in your writing that there's a lot of material detail and that you make it work. You make it work for the meaning of your books.
I'm not fully aware of that, I have to say. by domestic stuff, I guess, when I wrote The Household Guide to Dying, yes, because that was a metafictional novel in which the narrator was also writing how-to books, like domestic advice books.
That was the one I was thinking of mainly, yeah.
So I had to make a conscious effort to get my head around what that would mean in terms of writing the novel, which meant having a bit of a think about advice, domestic advice, and reading a bit in that genre, but not too much, because then you go into that realm where you've over-researched, and that's just one of the ways you're going to kill a story, for sure. But it was true that a long, long time ago, I used to love reading the Sun Herald's page, You Say, We Pay. Does anyone remember this? I loved it. I stopped reading the Herald when they got rid of it, because it fascinated me, because there were wonderful little micro-narratives. This is a column where people would write in with their problems, domestic problems, and other readers would write back in and respond, and they'd get a $2 lottery ticket if they got their letter published. And it always fascinated me, because you would get some random person saying, please help me, I've lost the recipe for my favourite Christmas cake, I've been baking it for 20 years and it's got this and this in it, does someone have the recipe? And I'd think, if you've been baking it for 20 years, why do you need the recipe? Or really weird stuff, you know, did you know you can use the empty cartridges from disposable razor blades turned upside down as useful soap holders in the shower? And I think, what kind of person thinks of that stuff, you know? And they just little windows into ordinary lives that I like imagining, I guess, which is one of the ways that fiction starts for me, is something very, very ordinary. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff, I suppose, generating a novel like The Household Guide to Dying. What I'm conscious of is that kind of stuff, which to me is research, and to me is very important. That's what everyday life is all about, and we're all ordinary people. But that your stereotypical male reader would disdain because it's so very boringly domestic. I'm not interested in stuff of a technical nature. I'm not interested in finding out how machinery works so I can then explain that in great detail in a novel. I'm not interested in explaining anything actually in great detail in a novel. And I am very conscious, I suppose, that men, it's awfully easy to make generalisations in a topic like it's too easy to make generalisations, and we probably will make more before we end. But it is true that men are much more interested in the technical side of stuff. And I have noticed from the male students that I've taught over years that if they're writing a novel that's a science fiction novel or speculative fiction or a thriller or a crime novel, there is a great deal of information and there's a great anxiety about getting that information correct.
Right.
As if they feel the reader is judging them or will judge them badly if that's not correct. And that interests me very much.
Sometimes the reader is. Elizabeth Joly once told a wonderful story about a letter she got from an elderly male reader scolding her for a particular detail in one of her books. He said, "Don't you know that doves never roost in a Moreton Bay fig tree?"
Yeah. Do you know, I have had letters like that, and they have always been from men.
Fancy.
Yeah.
Just in my Uber here yesterday, I said to the driver, I told him about he asked me what I was doing, told him the title of the panel, and he said, I only read non-fiction. And I said, why is that? He said, because it's faster to read than fiction. We didn't get any further than that, I just went, okay, I've got to make a phone call.
So a book is something unpleasant that you have to get through as quickly as possible.
I don't know, but I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I think things are easy to read when you enjoy reading them.
Exactly.
I think that's what it is. It's a challenge, it's a chore if you're not enjoying what you're in. But when I got out, I said, try reading a novel. but I don't know that he'd even tried. And that's fine. I mean, I think we had this conversation, all reading matters. I'm not really too concerned about who reads what, as long as people are reading, to be honest with you. Because I think, and that's where we find as writers, that's where I find the gaps in what's being written, and how do we reach audiences how do I reach an audience that I think should be reading about a certain issue? If we can't expect them to be, if men aren't reading fiction, how do I reach them to learn about something that I think they should be reading about? That might sound arrogant, but I mean, there's so many gaps in the literary landscape in terms of Aboriginal voices that I have to do that. I have a responsibility, I feel, to do that. So I'm not too concerned. I know we're talking about this and it's an important issue, but I'm not too hung up on the fact that men aren't reading my novels, to be honest with you. Because I know lots of women are, and as long as they're reading and they're having conversations about the stories, whether it's about relationships or having children or not having children, or whether it's about, the anti-intervention that's written into a novel, I don't mind as long as they're engaging with the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We'll go to questions in a minute because but before we do, I've got one last idea to run past these ladies, and it's this. I read a lot of did a lot of research for this panel, and a lot of what I read was surveys. People had actually done, it wasn't just, raw statistics from libraries. It was surveys where they actually asked readers, what their relationship was, I suppose, to the reading that they were doing. And one of the overwhelmingly female responses that they got was that a lot of women readers tended to see novels, favourite novels, as friends and supports through tough times. And that really spoke to me because I thought about the books I take, on the rare occasions when I have to go into hospital, for example. I think very, very carefully, about what I'm going to take with me that I know will be a good companion if I'm in pain or feeling lonely or I'm sick or whatever. I think really carefully about that. So I wanted to ask all of you, have you got books like that you think of as friends and supports that you take with you on times of stress? Anna, what about you?
I think that's a good question. I can't think of anything that would come to mind that I'm particularly proud of saying. Well, no, for this reason. So, one of my absolute all-time favourite books is Anna Karenina, and I would take that with me because it's just absolutely beautiful, and it's full of great insights. It's also kind of flawed and baggy and magnificent, and I really love it. But the thing that annoys me about it, of course, is that Anna has to die in order to give it some kind of gravitas, which is why I say I don't want to admit that I would probably take it, but the feminist in me objects very much to the death of a woman being used, like in every single opera, or much fiction. So it's not, you don't have men reading books where the men. Woman die. It's a bit like, it's not as bad as a man dying, and it's slightly more serious than a pet. And so that's the book I would take, but with that misgiving.
And what is it about a book like that then that is a reassurance for you, that would make you feel?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know that there is reassurance in it. I love just the sheer beauty of it as a piece of art, the insight, the sort of guts and glory of it. It's fantastic writing, and I find that comforting that such a great work exists. I don't mean it actually comforts me in any... It doesn't tell me things will be all right, because they won't.
No, exactly. Exactly. That book is in the world, and that's enough to know. Deborah, I've got a feeling I could guess what your answer to this question might be.
You might be able to guess, but it's very interesting, Anna, that that's a book written by a man for men, primarily for male readers.
Anna Karenina, you mean? Yeah.
So is like a lot of high literature. So if you look at the novel form, when it rises in the, late well, in the 17th century, really, it's seen as, it's utterly disparaged. It's what women are, women are reading, and until Sterne and Hawthorne and so on get onto it. And Austen is the outlier there, but it's a thing that women are reading in private. It's trivial and frivolous and so on. And then the men take it over, and it becomes this great 19th century behemoth that you know more about than probably anybody in this room. And then, you know, we're seeing that kind of unravel as well. So it depends where you put your stresses. I don't know that Tolstoy would have known that women would read it, but it's a lot more satisfying for a man to read about the death of a woman than for a woman to read about the death of a woman. Yeah. So for reasons that we see in, you know, domestic violence statistics and everything else. So I think that it's really complicated, which is why I would take that with me to hospital, but in a complicated manner. In a complicated manner. What about Debra?
Well, look, I might take Wuthering Heights. Fortunately, I don't have to think about what book I might take to hospital because I'm pretty healthy. And the reason I'm assuming that's what you were thinking of. And the reason I would take it is because I think if I were in that situation where I had nothing else to do, but I wasn't very well, I might not be able to get my head around a new book. I might want to reread something that's familiar. And I might take something like Wuthering Heights because while I've read it quite a few times, I guess when I'm thinking of rereading a book like that, I think, oh, well, I've read it so many times. I know it really well. I shouldn't reread it. I should read something else. But I should know better than anyone that there's no shoulds in reading. You should read exactly what you want to read and not censor yourself. So if you want to reread Wuthering Heights twice a year or whatever, I should just do it. Unfortunately, it's another book in which a woman dies, but many women. It's the 19th century. What are you going to do? I look, you know, for exactly the same reason. I lost my dad earlier this year, and we knew that this would happen, and we knew pretty much the day on which it would happen. And I was taking the day shift by his bedside, and I looked at the bookshelf, thought, this is going to be 6 or 7 hours, what will I take with me? And so I pulled out the bedraggled copy of Jane Eyre, for exactly the same reason that I think you'd probably take Wuthering Heights and you would take Anna Karenina, because I knew that no matter how many times I had read it, there would be things in it that would speak to me, that would take me away from the bedside, that would, you know, that would do that for me. So I remember when my younger son was very sick in hospital, quite a long time ago, and I couldn't focus on his ridiculous high temperature and the fact that he was waiting for a blood transfusion without letting myself fall into absolute hysteria. So I just sat there rereading Lolita, which might seem the weirdest choice of a book in those circumstances, but because it's such a beautiful novel, so powerfully written, so intriguing, a novel like that, I think, really comforts you because you know what the story is, but you're not reading it for the story, you're reading it for a whole lot of other reasons. And I just found that similarly a kind of comforting thing. Yeah. Anita, what about you? Have you got a friend and companion?
I always say if my house was on fire, I would grab two things, and that is a set of my parents' wedding photos, because they had the ultimate love story, I believe, and I would grab my hardcover copy of Kath Walker's We Are Going, which came out in 1964, and because she was such a pioneer, and I met her, and she's a role model in terms of writing, and there's warm, funny poems in like Ballad of the Totems, but there's the Charter of Aboriginal Rights, and it for me it embodies everything about my purpose as a writer, as a human being, I should say. And so I would grab that, and someone bought that at Berkelow's secondhand joint, not realising it was such a, for me as a gift, not realising it was such a significant text, and it was the first book of poetry published by an Aboriginal person. And so brilliant was her skill in writing that reviewers at the time didn't believe it had been written by a woman, let alone a black fella. So that's my most prized possession. Well, I think I had to take novels I would take really quickly with no explanation, well, except for Jane Austen's the original chick lit author, Emma, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Excellent. I love it that we're all reverting to the 19th century. It says something, I'm not sure what. Okay, look, I'll tell you what we might do now is take some questions from the audience. Now, where you were going to choose the
questions, weren't you? We've got the roving mics, so wait for them.
I think you're all being very kind and we're all pussyfooting and being softly about men reading fiction and not really discussing it, which is fine. But it just absolutely enrages me. I mean, first of all, men create culture. So they have to read, we have to want them to read what women are writing. Secondly, when men write books about the domestic, look at who wrote the correction? Jonathan Franzen or Carl Van, Danish-Norwegian guy who wrote 6 tomes about the domestic. It's seen as incredibly important literature, but when women write it, it's not. So that really gets me. So I think we need to be a bit angrier and a bit more forceful and get our stories out there and ask men why they're not bloody listening and reading and engaging with women. That's all.
A totally different way. Would the women and men divide change when it comes to detective story genre? Is that the genre where men would read as many fiction books as women?
That's a great question. I, in fact, was reading something about this last night, actually, and apparently there are statistics to say that women do read more crime fiction than men, although the difference is smaller. And one of the neurobiologist types who was speculating about this said that it's because men like to have things. This comes back to men reading manuals. Men like to have things laid out and explained to them. Women like to guess. The whole, the central thing in crime fiction is trying to work out who done it before you get to the end. And of that slow reveal of finding out what the mystery is. And then this guy was saying that women just prefer to be hinted at and to solve the problems of other people's minds themselves, whereas men just like to be told, what happened. So I thought, it's not necessarily what I believe, but I thought it was a really interesting take.
It'd be really interesting to see what Pam Newton has to say as a crime writer and published as PM Newton, so... And I don't want to speak for Pam, so we can all Google Pam's work, and her books are brilliant. But why she published under PM Newton, so it's not gender specific?
Yeah. No, I don't either. I don't know whether there are stats to prove it. I think, from what I can make out, men tend to sort of go more towards the spy novels, spy thrillers, action thrillers, things like that. I'm not even sure that men don't like books in which men die. I think men really like books in which lots of men die, as long as it's not the hero with whom they are identifying. So it's...
There's some men who only read war literature, and lots of men die in war literature.
Lots.
Yeah.
I was thinking when Anna was speaking before about... So Barbed Wire and Cherry Blossoms is about World War II in the POW camp and the Carib breakout. But I know when I was putting things on Instagram, I always hashtagged military history. Novel, but it's historical fiction and it is about the war. So I was obviously thinking, there were men following that hashtag. Maybe I'll have a look at it.
You are a strategic
I was
thinker,
not
aren't you?
saying that men don't like books in which men die. They don't. Obviously, I'm talking about the main character. So they love a lot of slaughter. Like we're good for slaughter. Yes. So I just like to respond to your enraged and magnificent comment. And I think there are a lot of enraged women out there. And I think that if and when the world changes so that women have more power, men will really want to know what we're thinking. And I think that may be happening. And just on the detective fiction, I was thinking this morning as I was coming in here that when I was about 9, two things. My son is 9 and he said, "What are you doing today, Mum?" And I said, "I'm going in to talk at this event. It's why women read fiction and men don't." So this is a comment about whether the world will change, not solely because of my 9-year-old boy, But he said, what is it? Why women read fiction and men don't? And he said, Mum, I think that's sexist. And he was a little upset because he's a novel reader, so there's a glimmer of hope. And then I was thinking about detective fiction, and I grew up reading my father's Maigret and Simenon stuff and all the Nero Wolfe stuff. And I was thinking about it. I was sitting at my desk this morning and just thinking what that did as a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old was all the women in that are all babes. They're all described by what they look like, how hot they are, their marital status, and they're all, And as a little girl, you're identifying with the detective, but you have to also all of a sudden see yourself as someone who's going to be the totally objectified babe. And that is schizophrenic, and we all live with that. So we grow up having 2 points of view always. We are the person who is seen and the person doing the seeing. And men just don't have that. So they're not bifurcated in that way. And I think that's a matter of, that gives us an advantage in empathy, much as it gives us social and political disadvantage.
Can I say also, I think it's generational, because I do a lot of work in schools and boys are reading. They're increasingly reading more work. And it's also about authors creating resources and writing books where young Australian boys can see themselves on the page as well. All kinds of boys. And so I think it is generational. I think my father read Westerns, and then my brothers sometimes read the books I give them. I was saying if I see my book on eBay that's autographed, I text my brothers straight away and say, that better not be a book I gave you. But interestingly, they read biography as well, but sporting biographies, they're both, fitness, whatever. And but I think there is change. I think it is generational, and I think kids that are going through school now will be far more diverse in their reading. We'll have. And I think, and I'm sitting here thinking, I don't know how angry you wanted us to be up here today, but my whole life has been angry, and I'm tired. So, I'm not going to sit here and be angry about men not reading fiction, because there's more important things in my world to be angry about.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also the passion and the anger is important, but I've found as a writer, if you write from a position of anger and bitterness, you produce a very bad book, that you really have to step back as much as you can from those very extreme emotions. Because I've tried it and it hasn't done me any good.
Just very quickly on that, and then we'll move to the next question. If I can just add about the anger. Anger is the hinterland of what we're all doing in this room today. And that's as true for those of us on the stage as it is for all of you. Anger is why there's such a thing as the Feminist Writers' Festival, which would not have been a thinkable thing when I was growing up. What do you mean, what is this feminist? What do you mean, It's produced situations where we can think about these things, where we can raise them as questions. It's easy to be angry. I know this to my cost. But once you've actually sort of processed the anger and decided what you're going to do with it, then you can talk about ideas. But you can't get to where we are now without having the anger first. That would be my view.
Yes, I have a question, and this is regarding that boys reading fiction, and then as they get older, they seem to stop reading fiction. And I have a 9-year-old who also absolutely loves to read, more than my daughter does. But then I've been teaching a course with Debra at the university here where we're talking to 19, 20-year-olds, and a lot of the young men said they just stopped reading in high school, reading fiction particularly. So I'm wondering what's going on there. That love for fiction, is there not as much young adult fiction that's directed towards young men? Why aren't they read? I think a lot of young boys are reading a lot of fiction, but then I think as they grow older, they're not. So that's my question.
I was going to say something silly like they start reading porn, but I don't know. I don't have kids, so I don't feature that.
This might be where nature versus nurture takes over, because all the neurobiology stuff is very interesting, but there's also maybe boys get when they're getting socialised into masculinity. Perhaps a part of that is the notion that reading is somehow girly, week, something you don't do. You should be playing sport, not sitting on the, that kind of stuff. So it could be, sadly, part of the sort of masculine socialisation of adolescence as much as anything else. I wish it wasn't, but I think I might be partly right.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any research on this, and I'm aware that that's exactly what happens. That for young readers, there's almost no distinction between the boys and girls, and then as boys grow older, they drop off reading fiction or reading altogether. And I do think, from my own observations, that it's very much about socialisation. And I know because all my life I've had to defend my reading and my reading of fiction from both men and women, but as particularly time-wasting, self-indulgent, frivolous. In some contexts, the most self-indulgent thing you can be seen to be doing, apart from writing a novel, is to be seen reading a novel. Because the question for non-readers, for people to whom that is a mystery, is what are you getting out of it? What are you learning? And you can't always put your finger on that. You know you're getting a lot out of it, but you're not reading it because you want to learn something. You're reading it because you need to lose yourself in narrative. And you need to do that for a whole lot of reasons. But it's very gratifying now that science has, in the last 8 or 10 years, delivered good, hard evidence on why reading fiction, and particularly reading literary fiction, is very good for the development of the brain and good for developing empathy. So if you're interested in this, there's a lot of stuff. A lot of it's come out of Stanford University, which actually proves that reading is good for you, which we nerdy types have always known. We just haven't been able to back it up with good, hard scientific evidence.
But I love the idea that it's good for your brain. Throw away your Sudoku and your fish. Just read stories, read fiction.
It's interesting, like we talked about this at Byron this year about being told it's a guilty pleasure to read a particular genre. If you're reading romance, it's a guilty pleasure to do that. No one talks about watching a group of men running around a paddock with a ball filled with air as a guilty pleasure. Saturday afternoon, however long it goes for a long time, hours, as a guilty pleasure. No one ever describes it as that, ever.
No, they don't.
It's a norm, it's fine. But it's a guilty pleasure if you want to you're stealing hours out of your day to read a piece of fiction.
Not only that, but it formed one of the... I some years ago, published a book about Adelaide in a series about Australian cities. And one review in particular was very positive, except for one thing. And the one thing was that I did not say anything about football. This, of course, is Adelaide and therefore Australian rules. I had, in fact, spent 3 pages talking about football, but I was talking about the clubs and the socialness, and he took particular umbrage at me having said that the whole of Australian rules football culture is a psychoanalyst's paradise. I don't think there's any argument with that, but, he took umbrage. But the idea that was the one negative thing that would be said about that book, that there's not enough sport in it. Not only did he not regard it as a guilty pleasure, he regarded it as a crucial piece of the place.
See, this is whole thing, but we have no control as a writer how someone will read your work. So we all write through a lens, we all read through a lens. Everybody here today is listening to this through their own antenna and hearing things differently as well. And we have no control over that. So somebody else would have read that book and got value out of those 3 pages, and maybe...
Quite. We've got, still.
I have a very... Oh, is someone else? I have a very basic question for Debra. Did your son read Harry Potter?
Well, I actually read those books to him because he was quite young when they were around. He couldn't read them for himself. So that's why I ended up reading all the Harry Potter books, except for the last one, because I drew the line at the second last one. I thought was very, very weak and badly edited and too long. And after we got through all of that, I said, okay, that's it. I'm not reading another one. If you want to read the next one, you're going to read it to yourself. So he did.
So
but he hasn't reread them which is interesting.
But I mean, if he doesn't like books by women, he has actually loved 6 books by a woman.
Yeah. Yeah. But of course that was before. That was when he was a certain age. You know. He's older now. He's 21. Yeah.
So it appears that women are the consumers of fiction in the main, and I want to ask, who are the gatekeepers of fiction in your experience? Is it mostly men, partly men? I'm asking about agents, publishers, important people in your careers who let you be published writers. Who are the gatekeepers?
Why me? No, Anna.
That's an excellent question. Who are the gatekeepers? I think that in my experience, there are a lot of women in publishing and a lot of editors. My agent's a woman and so on. But the higher up you go in publishing houses, the fewer women. And that's as a kind of very bizarre inverse proportion. But there are a lot of women in publishing. I haven't had the experience of finding many obstacles or anything like that. So.
I had following on from what Anna just said, I was teaching creative writing at Melbourne Uni 20 years ago, and I asked the, alas, late and very great Australian publisher John Iremonger, who was then head of Melbourne, the head of Melbourne University Publishing, if he would come and speak to my creative writing class. And he was great. He said he would. He came in and he saw that they were mostly women, young women, and he said, look, in where I work and in every other publishing house I've ever worked in and know about, he said there's a pyramid. The bottom layer is entirely women. So is the next layer and the one after that. He said, as it happens at the moment, he said at Melbourne University Publishing, there's me and everybody else in that building is a woman. And then he sort of said, he spoke directly to the class and he said, you have to change that. It's not good enough. It's up to you, women, young women, to change it. I don't know how successful they've been. I certainly think one of the reasons that Hilary McPhee and Di Gribble have legendary status in the history of Australian publishing is that what they did, setting themselves up as a feminist publishing house, a successful one, was extraordinary, was revolutionary. And that was only in the late 1970s. For the usual reasons, men tend to rise to the top for the usual reasons that one sees in the workplace. I don't know that I've always taken issue with the term gatekeepers. It bothers me. I'm not sure it's completely... It sort of suggests that people are being shut out. And my personal experience, and other people may say differently, my personal experience is not so much that people get shut out, it's that people get taken up. So... when someone, for example, I've been on grants selection committees and people have buttonholed me at parties and said, why was why was my grant application rejected? And I'd have to say, look, it wasn't rejected as such. We only had, 3 grants to give and 3 people were successful. It wasn't a negative decision. So the gatekeeper metaphor doesn't quite work for me because it's not a matter of keeping people out as such. It's a matter of there being limited resources and, limited funds and limited paper in the world and limited readerships and all that kind of stuff. That said, of course, there's a huge amount of prejudice and unconscious bias in the choices that get made in publishing. Not as much now as there used to be.
I'm kind of just echo something on. I think that if you look at the VIDA statistics that you might be familiar with, about who's reviewed and how much of the review pages and who's doing the reviewing and are they books by women or by men. I think in that context my impression is, especially with the bigger American magazines, that the editor, that again this pyramid applies and that those decisions are often being made by men. So they have a lot of unconscious bias to overcome, I think, before those statistics come out in any way even.
I think also I'm old enough to have a sense of how things have changed for the better in publishing, and if there are gatekeepers in publishing and they're women, thank God for that. It's wonderful. In my experience, I have dealt with, at an editorial publishing, agenting level, predominantly, and sometimes exclusively with women. But there's a context for all of this which goes back to when we were emerging as readers, and I can remember when my second year of my BA at Sydney University, I was actually doing 2 English courses, and out of all the subjects that fed into those 2 courses, I was given one text to read, or there was one text to read, which was written by a woman, and it was a Jane Austen novel. And at the time, some other undergraduates and I jumped up and down and said, this wasn't good enough, we have to have subjects that include books by women, most of the students being female, mind you. And there was great kerfuffle in the dusty old English department of Sydney University. We were considered to be radicals. So there have been generations of women and men who've been brought up through school and university only on male literature. But we don't call it male literature. It was just called, you know, romantic poets.
Debra, this might be the moment to quote the late great Thea Astley.
Well, okay, here's something I prepared earlier. Yeah, when I was thinking about this panel, I was reminded of this wonderful book, Rooms of Their Own, that Jennifer Ellison brought out nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah, I know, it's terrible, isn't it?
And she interviewed a number of female writers, and Thea Astley, who's one of my favourite authors, was amongst them. And the interviewer had asked her a question about what it is that men and women wanted to read, and Thea Astley said, you know, she thought women want very different things from a novel than men. And she came back and said to Ellison, you have to remember my age. She said, men didn't listen to women when they expressed an opinion. I always felt that they wouldn't read books written by women because it would be like listening to a woman for 3 hours, which would be intolerable. So Thea Astley, quite famously, when she was first writing, was not really writing in a female voice and didn't start exploring a distinctly female voice until her later novels, and the earlier novels were criticised for not being women's novels by a woman. But as she says, she grew up in a climate where men didn't listen to women, so why would they read a book, you know, written by a woman? So she tried to find a way to make it more neutral. In fact, in another interview, she said she felt she'd neutered herself and that she had to do that as a writer to be successful. And she was very successful. As you mentioned earlier, she won 4 Miles Franklins, for instance. And my theory is that men that are not reading fiction, and they're not reading fiction by women, not because they're less imaginative, not because they're less interested in fiction, because they're wonderful male fiction writers and fictional critics like James Wood, you know, fantastic critic on fiction, but that they're conditioned to hear their own voices. So they don't, I guess when they go to look for books to read, they are looking for affirmation of those kinds of voices, and they're not so interested in looking to challenge that. Whereas, as Anna mentioned earlier, women are brought up with the idea that women are objects and subjects, and they're used to exploring very different representations of the self.
There's a great, like the great feminist theorist Simone de Beauvoir, a line I've never forgotten. She said, there are 2 kinds of people, human a human being, she's accused of trying to be a man.
Yeah.
I think was what happened to Thea.
That might be all we have time for, but I think it's a beautiful note to end on. I can see that we have more questions, but I would encourage you to find our panellists outside and you can ask them at the signing table. So it was an amazing conversation. There's lots and lots to keep thinking about. Before we finish up, I just want to let everyone know that there are tickets remaining for today's other sessions and for this evening and for tomorrow. And you can just jump online, have a look at the program and purchase those. And a big thank you